If you hold this humble volume in your hands, dear reader, then like me you are bewitched by the thought of the vampire, the fiendish, diabolical creature that is feared above all others. Open these pages if you dare, and inside you will find much useful information to help and protect you in your quest for the unholy. You know, when it comes to Halloween in October, vampires are almost kind of required at this point. I mean, they're in everything. Movies, TV shows, video games, books upon books upon books. I mean, they're literally everywhere. But what is it that really fascinates us about vampires? Well, unfortunately, that's the topic for another video for another time, but I'm sure if you type that into Google, you'll probably find several sites, videos, papers, and stuff addressing the topic itself. But it's from such a fascination and love of vampires and classic horror cinema that we get this week's combatants for this episode of Monster Clash. Representing the old, we have the 1985 Tom Holland film, Fright Night. And representing the new, we have the 2011 remake by David Gillespie, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. It's the one with Colin Farrell and David Tennant. When it comes to the story, both films are identical in their setup. I mean, a new neighbor moves into Charlie Brewster's neighborhood. Charlie observes him for a while, discovers he's a vampire, calls upon the assistance of Peter Vincent to prove that he is a vampire and basically, well, stake him. And everyone thinks he's crazy for most of the film. That's pretty much where the similarities end, because the key difference between the two stories of the films is primarily the characters and how the characters were interpreted, tweaked, and such. In the 1985 version, Charlie is your typical teenager. He's got a decent-looking girlfriend, a mildly obnoxious and moderately skeptical friend, and his interests outside of high school, namely being in the Fright Night programming block hosted by Peter Vincent. He's not an outright caricature of teenagers at the time, but he is still a bit of a dork who's easily distracted, much to the chagrin of his girlfriend, Amy. And while the film does play up the fact that he's pretty much alone in his knowledge of the villain's intentions, the villain being Jerry Dandridge, who in the 1985 version is played by Chris Sarandon, the film almost takes an omniscient approach. It tries to kind of tell every aspect of the story, whereas, at least in my opinion, it could have really benefited from being more of a third-person story, keeping more of the focus on Charlie and kind of having us only really see what Charlie sees, instead of having kind of the omniscient, oh, his friends go to recruit Peter Vincent, instead of, like, it could have benefited from being more focused on really playing up the fact that he's pretty much alone in his knowledge, and is pretty much the only one who knows and can stop Jerry Dandridge from essentially sucking the entire town dry. In the case of the remake, on the other hand, we see almost a downright role reversal between Charlie and Ed. In the 85 version, Charlie was the dork and Ed was the skeptic, whereas in the remake, Charlie's the skeptic and Ed is the dork. Now this is done mostly to establish a strained friendship between the two, as Charlie in the remake pretty much did the thing that some people try to do in high school, where they kind of completely try to distance themselves from their past friends and past interests in order to look cool. And really, it also just provides a good motivator for Ed's eventual turn into a vampire, which happens much earlier in this version than it does in the original. Another key difference is the villain, Jerry Dandridge, which for some reason has different last name spellings in both versions, which was kind of confusing when I was doing the write-up of this video. Let's start with the original. The original was a lot more mysterious. He only really retaliated. He never really directly attacked Charlie. Yes, he did kind of attack him to kind of rough him up a little bit, but it was more retaliatory. But for the most part, he kind of stayed in the background, stayed mysterious, and kind of played the part of the friendly neighbor. The 2011 version of Jerry Dandridge is a lot more direct and aggressive. A little too aggressive, as, well, a lot of his actions can't be easily as written off by the police as the actions of the 1985 version of Jerry Dandridge. I mean, come on. If you blow up your neighbor's house by digging up their gas vein and lighting it on fire, people are gonna ask questions. I'm sorry, but that's just... what? Finally, there's Peter Vincent. Boy, do we have some major changes here, as they kind of change the character to match the locations in which the film are set. In the case of the 1985 version, it's set in a suburb that's not really specified where it's set, just modern suburb. Whereas the 2011 version is specifically set in Nevada, in a neighborhood that's adjacent to the Vegas Strip. The 1985 version of Peter Vincent is more of a loose amalgamation of Peter Cushing and Vincent Price, and is more of a send-up to the classic Hammer horror monster movies. I mean, Hammer was kind of the spiritual successor of the Universal monster movies at the time, and so they kind of made Peter Vincent as a loose homage. It's clear that he's an old man, past his prime, who was once a notable actor in his own right, and is now relegated to hosting a local television programming block showing horror movies. As such, this is a classic case of an actor suddenly being asked to live up to the image that they've established over the many years of their career. despite being completely terrified of everything that's actually going on once he actually realizes that there's stuff going down. In the case of the remake, we're given equal parts Criss Angel and Marilyn Manson, as Peter Vincent is now a Las Vegas magician who has vampire slaying be a motif of his magic act. As such, he comes across more as a brash, drunkard celebrity than he did the old man past his prime trying to live up to an image. And, well, one thing that I had a problem with was how they tried to give Peter Vincent this tragic backstory. The whole, oh, vampires killed my family when I was a kid. I'm sorry, but that was just stupid. And on top of that, it negated the whole fiction becomes fact element of the story. On top of that, having Dandridge being the same vampire that killed Peter Vincent's family when he was a kid, that was just way too coincidental to the point of stupidity. It's the same reason why having the Joker killing Batman's parents in the Tim Burton films didn't work. It's just way too coincidental and negates one of the huge elements the story had. So which film has the better story? Well, a lot of this comes down to, as you can plainly see, which film I had the least complaints about. I mean, I had some complaints about the older version, but, I mean, come on. I mean, the 2011 version has some merit to it, but some of the writing decisions... I mean, it's not like they completely broke the movie for me, but it was just a case of, well, they were stupid. I mean, oh, a whole family killed by vampires thing. Oh, it turns out to be the same vampire that you're dealing with. This round goes to the old. The reason why I have Atmosphere as the second round this time is because both films come from a modern aesthetic and really reflect the times in which they were made. Looking at the original, it screams classic 80s, just looking at the sets, looking at the costumes, but you can tell they're not really trying to make a period piece, they were just trying to make it look like how people dressed at the time. However, a lot of this is juxtaposed by the gothic imagery that we see from within Dandridge's house. While everything around him is sleek and modern, the exterior of the house is old and looks like it's about to fall apart, and much of the interior is a reflection of days past. There's almost kind of a sentimentality to it all, which is something that also shows up in the character himself, Dandridge. And so, really, it's an example of how a set can communicate a lot of information about the character that lives in it. And that was one thing I really liked. And you see the same sort of parallel with Peter Vincent's apartment. It too contains a lot of artifacts and relics from across his lifetime, and it contains that same sense of sentimentality, the wish to go back to the good old days where things were a lot better for both characters. And again, that creates a nice parallel between the hunter and the vampire, or hunter being in quotation marks, and really showing that they're kind of similar in that regard. That was something I didn't really notice until I actually started thinking about it, and really, it's almost ingenious. Without realizing it, your brain is being fed information without having to do it through exposition. In the case of the remake, however, we don't really see that. I mean, a lot of it is exchanged for stuff that just looks sleek and modern all around. In the case with Dandridge's house, you don't really see that much of that sentimentality. A lot of it's really utilitarian, which I guess makes sense with the way they chose to establish the character. He's more of a utilitarian. He's not really much about sentiment, he's more about just getting stuff done, reviving his clan, having like a huge army of vampire servants. And so really, it kind of shows in the sense that he doesn't really pay attention to a lot of the other parts of his house. I mean, during the brief things that you see in his house, everything is pretty much, I mean, aside from it being dark, which, he's a vampire, it's just a case of, there's not that much attention to what everything else had in it, and I guess that makes sense since most of Dandridge's attention was focused on digging that underground lair as well as building that makeshift prison. It's basically, all of his attention is focused on stuff that you don't see immediately, but on the same note, it doesn't really communicate all that much about his character when we don't really see that much to the set itself. In the case of Peter Vincent's apartment, although you do have like a lot of the gothic stuff with it, it feels kind of hollow, which I guess speaks more to the character of Peter Vincent in the film, as he's just more of a showman and the whole vampire slayer thing is essentially an act. However, you don't really see any real sentimentality to it, save for like the secret safe he has when he finds out about the clan that the vampire is from. But really, you look at the set, and you see a museum, but more in this case that it's, well, hollow. It's just a presentation. There's no real sentimentality or depth behind it. While it can be argued that you can glean information from the rooms of the main characters in the case of Charlie, well, really, what I saw was just typical teenagers, and so I didn't really get that much information in either film. But this round is still a lot easier to decide based on what I discussed. I mean, I was able to glean a lot more insight into the characters in the set design of the original Fright than I could in the remake. And so really, it was just a case that I could get a lot more visual information out of it, and just got a lot more out of the atmosphere in general. As such, this round goes to the old. There were no major character threads or elements to either film that could really serve as a good round 3, so what we're going to use to decide this round is which film had the best climax. Which film had the best showdown between Charlie Brewster, Peter Vincent, and Jerry Dandridge. In the case of the original, there's a lot of slow build-up. I mean, you see Charlie getting ready to go into it alone, but then Peter Vincent suddenly appears and say, "Hey, I'm going to help you." And the climax itself just takes an overall slow pace. Almost a little too slow, as it feels kind of drawn out. I mean, you have them go in, Dandridge gives his cocky speech, Charlie gets knocked off the stairs, Vincent runs away for his life, has the whole scene with Vampire Ed, and then after killing Vampire Ed, comes back and says, "Hey, I'll help you escape," and all that. And really, it feels almost kind of long and drawn out, and also kind of devolves into a special effects spectacle, and not in a good way. I mean, it's one thing to have some pretty impressive effects, but if you just have effect after effect after effect, it gets kind of old after a while. As for how the vampire himself is killed, it's actually pretty cool. I mean, they wait him out until the sun starts to come up, and basically they chase him into the basement, start smashing all the windows, and when he's out and about trying to stop them from smashing the windows and trying to kill them once and for all, Peter Vincent closes the coffin so he can't get back in. But one thing I had a problem with is, why would you have a huge sunlight thing right behind your coffin? I mean, I understand you're trying to block it out, but you think you would block it out with something more than just cloth. You would probably want to, I don't know, have it near a brick wall or something, just an area where there's just no light. I mean, I understand there's only so much they could do, but that was one problem I had with the climax. Other than that, though, it's pretty cool, and it has a nice impromptu feel to it. In the case of the remake, the climax has a much more faster pace. I mean, it starts off with the montage of Charlie getting the stuff from the hunting store, and he waits until daylight, goes into the house, and basically he's kind of doing almost like a military-style raid, like smashing all the windows and just storming through, searching for Dandridge. We do have the reunion with Peter Vincent with the whole, "Oh yeah, I'm going to help you because I don't want da-da-da-da-da-da." And so basically they find the trapdoor, find his secret underground cellar, leading to Charlie being locked with Vampire Amy and Vincent having a direct confrontation with Dandridge, which leads to the stupid plot twist of, "Oh, I'm the vampire that killed your parents." And then we basically have almost kind of a modern version / retread of what we saw in the 1985 version. Basically, Charlie finds a way to stop Amy, in this case, literally just stabbing her with a stake, but making sure not to hit her heart. Gets out of the room, sees that Vincent's being fed on by a bunch of vampire servants that Dandridge had created over the time that he had moved in that neighborhood. And then, instead of breaking windows, we see him kind of busting the floorboards in order to kind of create sort of a safe haven for them to allow them a brief moment of respite. I mean, true, Vincent is starting to turn because he'd essentially been nommed on by a whole bunch of vampires. And basically, it's kind of a case of, oh yeah, you have to wait for the sun to come down. But this leads to what I believe is my favorite moment of the film, and probably the best way to take down a vampire. Charlie lights himself on fire, grabs onto Dandridge, clips to his belt so that he can't shake him off, and is literally holding onto him while he is on fire. I mean, that is awesome. I mean, I may have had my problems with the remake, but that is just a really, really awesome way to kill a vampire. It's basically a fiery tackle, and having him kind of like, "Ah, I'm on fire," and then basically staking him into his now exposed heart. I'm surprised more films haven't really tried that, but really, that was frickin' amazing. And, well, one thing I definitely do have to say is that while the original did kind of devolve into a special effects spectacle, the improved technologies and special effects did definitely help this film, as it made transitioning into the effects a little bit easier. Not to mention that we also saw more of the effects earlier in the film, and so we were more used to the fact that it was going to be a special effects film, as opposed to the original that kept most of the effects until the very end. Overall, the climax in the remake just has a much faster pace and tends to flow a little more smoothly, since a lot of the lines that kind of slowed down the climax in the original were already addressed earlier in the film, allowing it to flow more smoothly. Plus, fire tackle. I mean, true, it's like, oh yeah, we trapped him outside and exposed in sunlight, but fire tackle. I mean, it's freaking awesome! As such, I'm giving this round to the remake. Now, both films are really well done horror films and really exemplify what vampire stories used to be. Tales that were meant to inspire fear, with lust being an undertone. Unlike a lot of other stuff that's been produced with vampires throughout this entire decade alone. However, this isn't one of those films that really demands a perfect version of the story, because really the story itself isn't really a huge landmark of horror cinema. It's basically just a modern day vampire story, and that's really all it needs to be. True, the remake had problems, but really, with the source material, there wasn't really that much to really go off of. Yes, it could have been improved and maybe have kept some of the subtle elements Dandridge had in the original, but really, there's no reason to kind of say, oh, if we took this and combined them together, we'd get a perfect version, because really, There's not much to it. Just modern-day vampire story. That's it. On a final note, no, I will not be doing a Monster Clash of the sequel, because really, the sequel to the 1985 version actually was a direct sequel, but the sequel to the remake is just a standalone movie, and really, they were both straight to video, so really, there's no point. For now, this battle draws to a close in favor of the 1985 version of Fright Night, the superior film. Join me in 7 days, where East shall meet West as we take on a tale hailing from the land of the rising sun. But for now, this has been Monster Clash. Good night.